Welcome to Mikon's Hardware. In this video, I'm going to compare 3 different CPUs and 22 games using my AMD RX 6800 XT graphics card at 1080p screen resolution. This video was made to explain and demonstrate why I think Core i5-10400F is one of the best budget gaming CPUs on the market. Often people are asking me to recommend a gaming CPU, and when I recommend this 6-core CPU which does not support overclocking and works at about 4 GHz in games, people are getting skeptical and telling me that a 12-core Xeon is a much better option because it's much more future-proof. So in this video I'm going to compare Core i5-10400F towards Mutant QQ-LS, which has 8 cores, 16 threads and ability to overclock. The last compared CPU will be Ryzen 5 5600X, which is right now one of the best gaming CPUs. It takes a lot of time to tell about every tested game, and according to the polls and statistics, many of my viewers are actually listening to the videos and not watching the screen. That's why I'm gonna do the following. First, I name the game, then I tell the FPS values, then I add a few comments from myself, and then I move on to the next game. Let's get started. The first tested CPU will be this Core i5-10400F. It has 6 cores, 16 threads, turbo boost frequency up to 4.3 GHz. The CPU is locked, and under gaming conditions, the CPU clock frequency stays about 4.1 GHz. The CPU was tested on MSI Z590A Pro motherboard, but you can use any semi-decent B560 motherboard to achieve exactly the same level of performance. Intel has unlocked memory overclocking for the cheap B560 chipset. That's why in this testing I'm going to use DDR4-3466-CL14. The next tested CPU is QQ-LS, which is a mobile option of Core i9-9900K. The CPU is tested on my ASRock B365 Pro 4 motherboard, and even though B365 chipset does not support overclocking for the regular desktop CPUs, it is possible to overclock Mutants on this motherboard. For this test, I have tested my QQ-LS at 4.5 GHz on all cores. Memory speed is DDR4-2666-CL13. If you think that I should have pushed my QQ-LS to 4.6, 4.7 or even higher clock frequency, and that I should have used only 2 memory sticks instead of 4 memory sticks to achieve high memory clock frequency, I suggest you to watch my other video where I test multiple different memory configurations and multiple different motherboards with this QQ-LS Mutant, and then you will understand why I have decided to go with 4.5 GHz and 4 sticks 8 GB each DDR4-2666. The last tested CPU is this Ryzen 5 5600X. So for this test I decided to go with MSI B450 Tomahawk Max 2. The B450 chipset does not support PCI Express 4.0, that's why this test is kind of unfair to Ryzen 5 CPU. Ryzen 5 and AMD RX 6800 XT both support PCI Express 4.0, and if I would use a B550 or X570 motherboard which supports PCI Express 4.0 connection, the gaming results would be slightly better, maybe 1 to 5% better, depends on the game. But I have decided to go with a B450 motherboard for 2 major reasons. First, I can find these B450 motherboards really cheap. For this MSI B450 Tomahawk Max I have paid less than 70 years and I have got delivered it to home brand new. Second, I have plans to test some Ryzen 1st series, 2nd series and 3rd series CPUs, and I needed a motherboard for that. Unfortunately, B550 and X570 chipset does not support older Ryzen CPUs, and I would have to buy 2 different motherboards to be able to test older and newer Ryzen CPUs, and I can't afford that just yet. I will tell a little bit more about each of the CPUs by the end of the video, but right now let's go straight into the gaming benchmarks. Battlefield 5. i5 delivers 85 and 159 FPS, QQ-LS improves the values to 83 and 162, Ryzen 5 94 and 184 FPS. Overall, i5 and QQ-LS are pretty evenly matched, while Ryzen 5 is often hitting the 200 FPS game limit, and sometimes the gap between Ryzen 5 and QQ-LS is more than 40 FPS. Red Dead Redemption 2. i5 gives us 33 and 103 FPS, QQ-LS 33 and 117 FPS, and Ryzen 5 36 and 110 FPS. In general, this is a very demanding game, and all 3 CPUs are demonstrating very similar performance. Nevertheless, i5 is lagging behind the other 2 CPUs by about 20 FPS, while 8-core QQ-LS and 6-core Ryzen 5 are trading blows. In some places Ryzen is slightly better, in other places 8-core QQ-LS is slightly better. GTA 5. Here i5 gives us 58 and 166 FPS, QQLS 48 and 170 FPS, and Ryzen 5 41 and 171 FPS. GTA 5 is a really old and really not optimized game. It doesn't matter what computer hardware you give to this game, you will still experience stutters and sudden FPS drops. Overall, Ryzen is the first and i5 is the last as expected. Far Cry New Dawn. i5 gives us 72 and 100 FPS, QQLS 75 and 160 FPS, Ryzen 5 78 and 114 FPS. This game really depends on the CPU IPC as well as memory clock frequency and memory latency. Even though QQLS has 500 MHz extra speed, it works at 4.5 GHz compared to 4 GHz of Core i5, it's still not able to pull ahead because it uses DDR4 2666, while i5 is tested with the DDR4 3466. Thus, QQLS and i5 are demonstrating very similar performance, while Ryzen 5 5600X is slightly faster. Assassin's Creed Odyssey. i5 gives us 26 and 72 FPS, QQLS gives 26 and 77 FPS, and Ryzen 5 34 83 FPS. This is one more unoptimized stuttery game. Even though the game is kinda using all CPU cores, it still depends on the CPU IPC, memory clock frequency, and memory latency. Here, i5 lags behind QQLS by about 5 FPS, and QQLS lags behind Ryzen 5 by about 7 FPS. Assassin's Creed Valhalla. This is a much newer game and this one already uses DirectX 12. Here i5 gives us 65 and 105 FPS, QQLS improves to 83 and 122 FPS, while Ryzen 5 gives a very similar score of 84 and 118 FPS. i5 lags behind the 2 CPU by about 20 FPS, while 8-core QQLS and 6-core Ryzen 5 are basically the same. Watch Dogs Legion, yet another very CPU-intensive game, and here i5 gives us 58 and 90 FPS, QQLS 1700 FPS, Ryzen 5 84 and 111 FPS. Even though QQLS has 2 extra cores, its slower memory doesn't let it pull ahead from i5, and i5 loses only 10 FPS compared to QQLS. Ryzen 5 beats QQLS by about 15 FPS. This game really knows how to load CPUs. Tom Clancy's Rainbow Six Siege. i5 gives us 243 and 351 FPS, QQLS improves the values to 287 and 394 FPS, and Ryzen 5 beats the scores by more than 100 FPS, it gives us 427 and 565 FPS. All in all CPUs are capable of more than 200 FPS at all times. The small gap between i5 and QQLS of about 40 FPS is kinda meaningless here. Both of the CPUs are rendering more than 350 FPS on average, which is more than enough. Of course, Ryzen 5 is pulling ahead even more, it is able to render more than 550 FPS on average. Anno 1800. This game does not provide minimal FPS value, but it provides average FPS in different chunks or different sections of the game. Thus, for this test I have picked the minimal average value and the overall average value. i5 gives us 130 and 146 FPS, QQLS gives 138 and 155 FPS, Ryzen 5 improves the value to 151 and 156 FPS. Even though QQLS is about 10 FPS faster than Core i5, in some sections i5 is better than QQLS due to the faster memory. Ryzen 5 5600X beats both of them, especially by the minimal FPS value. Immortals Fenyx Rising. Even though the game is loading every CPU core, it is still horribly optimized. i5 gives us 23 and 75 FPS, QQLS 23 and 81 FPS, Ryzen 5 25 and 93 FPS. i5 and QQLS are almost identical, while Ryzen 5 is giving us about 15 FPS extra. F1 2021. i5 delivers 141 and 175 FPS, QQLS gives 221-273 FPS, and Ryzen 5 5600X scores about the same 222-274 FPS. This is one of the few games where a 6-core i5 is failing to deliver close performance to QQLS and Ryzen 5. Here, QQLS is about 100 FPS faster than i5, which is almost identical to Ryzen 5. Forza Horizon 4. This racing game is also very CPU dependent, and here i5 gives us 160-178 FPS, QQLS gives 174 and 209 FPS, while Ryzen 5 improves the value to 211 and 234 FPS. In general, i5 is about 25 FPS slower than QQLS, and QQLS is about 25 FPS slower than Ryzen 5. Shadow of the Tomb Raider, yet another CPU-intensive game. Here, i5 gives 99 and 141 FPS, QQLS 104 and 146 FPS, Ryzen 5 120 177 FPS. Even though on average QQLS is slightly faster than i5, in some sections i5 is actually slightly faster because of the faster memory. Ryzen 5 beats both of the CPUs by about 35 FPS. Total War 3 Kingdoms. i5 delivers 94 and 117 FPS, QQLS improves the values to 115 and 135 FPS, and Ryzen 5 gives 127 138 FPS. QQLS is about 20 FPS faster than i5, but it loses about 5 FPS to Ryzen 5. Horizon Zero Dawn, one more CPU-intensive game, and here i5 gives 63 and 127 FPS, QQLS delivers 78 and 154 FPS, Ryzen 5 slightly better values with 83 and 153 FPS. i5 lags behind QQLS and Ryzen 5 by about 25 FPS, QQLS and Ryzen are very similar on average FPS, while Ryzen is slightly faster by minimal FPS. Hitman 2, i5 gives us 48 and 138 FPS, QQLS delivers 52 and 132 FPS, Ryzen 5 beats both of them with 64 and 162 FPS. Even though QQLS has 2 extra CPU cores, the slow memory speed holds it back and it's not able to beat i5. In fact, by average FPS it's actually losing 5 frames. Ryzen 5 5600X beats both of them by about 30 FPS. Metro Exodus. i5 gives us 62 and 119 FPS, QQLS 76 and 133 FPS, Ryzen 5 70 and 133 FPS. In general, this game is horribly optimized for AMD CPUs, nevertheless 6-core Ryzen 5 and 8-core QQLS are demonstrating very similar performance, while 6-core i5 is about 15 FPS slower. Age of Empires 2 Definitive Edition. I have tested this game on purpose to see how these old games which have no idea about Ryzen CPUs will behave with the modern hardware. Here, i5 gives us 16 and 56 FPS, QQLS delivers the best result with 22 and 58 FPS, while Ryzen 5600X struggles with the minimal FPS and delivers only 3 FPS on minimum. The average value stays in line of 56 FPS. All in all, Age of Empires is a horribly optimized game and it doesn't matter which CPU you throw onto the game, it will lag and stutter. Still, we can see that i5 and QQLS are having better values compared to Ryzen 5 because the game has no clue how to use Ryzen CPUs. Digital Combat Simulator. i5 gives us 78 and 145 FPS, QQLS 75 and 153, Ryzen 5 pulls ahead with 114 and 154 FPS. This is one more horribly optimized game, or rather not optimized at all. Faster memory speed with i5 gives it slightly better 1% low, in fact it is 3 FPS faster than QQLS, but on average QQLS was slightly faster. On the other hand, Ryzen 5 is about 40 FPS faster than the other CPUs when comparing 1% lows. Gears 5. i5 gives us 90 and 143 FPS, QQLS basically identical 90 and 150 FPS, and Ryzen 5 101 160 FPS. All CPUs are demonstrating very similar performance, in some cases i5 is faster than QQLS, in others QQLS is faster than i5. Ryzen 5 in general is about 10 FPS faster than the other two. Now let's combine all these 20 games together and see the average results. On average, i5 gives us 82 and 135 FPS, QQLS gives 94 and 151 FPS, and Ryzen 5 increases the value to 108 167 FPS. As you can see, i5 is about 15 FPS slower than QQLS, and QQLS is about 15 FPS slower than Ryzen 5. Overall, I think it is a great result for the cheap Core i5 CPU. Finally, let's take a look at the power consumption using Assassin's Creed Valhalla benchmark, because in this game all 3 CPUs are demonstrating very similar results. It's important to mention that here I report entire system power consumption, and for these figures I'm using an external wattmeter which reports entire system power consumption, not only the CPU power consumption. Here, entire system with the i5 CPU consumed about 310 watts, QQLS consumed about 380 watts, and Ryzen 5 system consumed about 320 watts. In general, Core i5 and Ryzen 5 are consuming about the same amount of electricity, but on average Ryzen 5 is 30 FPS faster than Core i5. QQLS at 4.5 GHz is a power hog, and even though I have tested the CPU with -50 mV voltage reduction, it is still consuming 380 Watt, which is about 60 Watt extra compared to the other systems. It seems like 4 GHz is the so-called sweet spot for the 10th gen Intel CPUs, and when you push these CPUs beyond 4 GHz, the power consumption goes above the roof. On the other hand, the efficiency of Ryzen 5 5600X is truly impressive. Some of you probably have spotted that at the beginning I said that I have tested 22 games, but I have demonstrated only 20 games average. This is because 2 of the tested games are not providing meaningful results to be able to combine it together for the average values. The 21st tested game is Final Fantasy VII. The game benchmark does not provide FPS values, instead it is giving us 2 values. The first one is how long the system was loading some scenes, and the other one is the overall system score. Here, i5 loaded the scenes in 17 seconds and scored 23,000. QQLS took 1 second less and loaded the scenes in 16 seconds and scored the same 23,000. Ryzen 5 consumed only 14 seconds to load the scenes and scored 28,000. In general, i5 and QQLS are demonstrating very similar performance, but looking at the FPS values using MSI Afterburner, we can see that Ryzen 5 5600X is often faster than the other 2 CPUs by 30 to 200 FPS. The last tested game is Call of Duty Modern Warfare. Unfortunately, with the latest anti-cheat updates, the game is no longer compatible with MSI Afterburner and I cannot do my benchmarks. The game also does not have a built-in benchmark, thus I just have to use the in-game FPS counter. Even though I do not have minimal and average FPS values, going through the campaign we can see that the gap between the 3 CPUs is about 40 FPS. i5 lags behind QQLS by 40 FPS, and QQLS lags behind Ryzen 5 by 40 FPS. Nevertheless, even Core i5-10400F delivers very good and smooth gaming experience. So, after getting all of these test results, I hope it is pretty clear why I think that Core i5-10400F is one of the best budget-friendly gaming CPUs. The CPU is pretty cheap and you can right now buy it for about 150 euros, you can slap it on a cheap B560 motherboard, overclock memory to more than DDR4 3000 and get a very decent gaming computer for not too much money. If you have a very tight budget, it is also possible to use this Intel stock cooler which comes with the CPU. The stock cooler is loud and it is not enough to cool down the CPU under heavy load, but it is capable to keep the CPU cool under gaming conditions. So you can assemble your computer with this Intel stock cooler and then later on when you have some extra cash you can just replace it with something more decent. I hope this video also demonstrates why Ryzen 5 5600X is a far better option than Mutants with 8 cores or engineering samples with 8-10 cores, which can be bought on AliExpress for about the same or higher price than Ryzen 5 5600X. Even on B450 motherboard, which is very cheap these days, this CPU performs exceptionally well. Lately, I can see Ryzen 5 5600X on sales for about 220 to 250 euros, and I think it is a far better option than buying a QQLS for 150 euros and then investing into the old platform, buying expensive LJ1151 motherboard and expensive CPU cooler to keep the CPU cooled. Also, you need to remember that you need to modify your motherboard BIOS to be able to work with the QQLS or any other Mutant. The same as Core i5-10400F, which has a stock cooler, Ryzen 5 5600X also comes with a stock cooler. This cooler is slightly better than the Intel stock cooler, but it is not much better. It is just enough to keep the CPU cool in games, but it is not enough to keep the CPU cool under heavy load. Thus, if you are on a very tight budget and you're looking to get the maximum performance, you can invest into the CPU, into the graphics card, into the SSD, and forget about the cooler for the time being. Later on, when you have some extra cash, you can just buy a 20 or 30 euro CPU cooler, which will do a much better job than this AMD or this Intel junk. And lastly, QQLS. Right now, Chinese are asking about 150 or even more euros for this CPU. I think the price is unreasonable and it is only justifiable to buy this CPU if you already have a decent LJ1151 motherboard and you do not want to upgrade entire package. Thus, assembling a computer from scratch with QQLS at the moment doesn't make much sense. If the CPU price drops to about 100 euros, it will make more sense, but right now it is much better to buy a new Core i5-10400F or stretch your budget a little bit and buy the Ryzen 5 5600X. Of course, you are the only one in charge of your own money, and if you wish to buy QQLS, you like to overclock the CPU, you don't mind the excessive heat, and you like to modify the BIOS, then buy QQLS. On the other hand, if you would like to get a decent gaming computer which doesn't have any issues, you can just get this i5-10400F, slap on a cheap B560 motherboard, put it all into the computer, close down the computer and forget about it. It will just work. And Ryzen 5 5600X is obviously the best option you can do right now, and I would say it's the best reasonable gaming CPU. Some of you are probably wondering, but how about the Xeons? They have 12 cores and 24 threads, maybe they are better than i5 10400F. For you, I have some good news. I have already tested Xeon E5 2690V3, and the video comparison between this Xeon E5 2690V3 and Core i5 10400F is gonna be on the channel soon. For now though, thanks for watching, thanks for listening, I hope it was interesting, I hope it was helpful, bye bye!